Dragon Ball Z Budokai, a game that got me into Dragon Ball. My history with Dragon Ball started out on the wrong path. When I was young, VHSs were on their last legs to the almighty compact disc, and reruns were running rampant among the youth in the early and mid 2000s. DBZ was one of those reruns that ran on a block on Toonami, alongside Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball GT, but that wouldn't be my first interaction with the long-running series. In my hometown, there was this shop similar to a pawn shop, but not quite, as you couldn't sell them things, but they would sell you used goods. It's where I got my Woody from Toy Story toy from. Now that I think about it, it's more like they were just selling their old stuff that they didn't want anymore. Well, they were only open on weekends, and one day, my mom went there to get some tapes for our VHS, and somehow I ended up with Dragon Ball Z. To be honest, when I popped it in, I didn't like it that much. Not because of the action or the type of story, I just didn't know what was going on. The only thing I remember from the tape is that this random character said goodbye to these two characters as a green alien flies away with them, only to then blow himself up to destroy this pink blob a few moments later. Though DBZ would continue to air on Toonami, I really wasn't interested in it until a few years later when I got my hands on the hand-me-down PlayStation 2. I borrowed Dragon Ball Z Budokai from my uncle, and the rest was history from there. And while this was my origin story with Dragon Ball Z Budokai or Dragon Ball in general, Dragon Ball Z Budokai's origin story would come years before that. Developed by an up-and-coming development house at the time, DIMS. Dragon Ball Z Budokai was released in Europe on the PlayStation 2 November 2nd, 2002, while the US version was released December 3rd, 2002, and the Japanese release was February 13th, 2003. Usually, most Japanese games get a later port to the West like Naruto Classic Ninja, but in this case, it was released earlier over here in the West. Not only that, but the game was also published by different publishers for each regions. This was coming back in the time. Info Games published it in the US to Bandai's Europe and Japan release. Atari will also play a role in the publishing of this game. If you hadn't noticed in the footage used before, DBZ Budokai probably looks a little different in some clips compared to what you remember if you played on the PlayStation 2 like I did. As I mentioned before, Atari played a role in the release of Budokai. They would publish a port of Budokai for the Nintendo GameCube in the West that were released October 28, 2003 in North America and November 14, 2003 in Europe, with the Japanese release happening November 28, 2003. I didn't know there was a GameCube release for the game way back when. Only the PlayStation 2 and the HD collection, which released on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in November 2012. It seems like a few people did, as it would sell 78,000 in Japan on the GameCube alongside the 570,000 for the PlayStation 2. In total, it would end up selling over 3 million copies. A little fact about DBZ Budokai in Japan: the game there was only just called Dragon Ball Z compared to the Budokai added in the US and the European release. The European edition was different from its US counterpart in that it released with Japanese dub instead of an English dub done by Funimation. The PAL region version was the first Dragon Ball game to be released all across Europe instead of in certain parts. In addition to different language format, they all had their own box art as well. With old games, I try not to talk about graphics because they're old games, but with DBZ Budokai, I kinda have to due to the discrepancy between the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube release, mainly the shading. I should disclose that both versions are running on an emulator. Outside of the 16:9 in some cases, both versions have issues, whether it be lighting or the screen shaking due to the emulator. But other than that, I try to keep it as close as possible to my native PlayStation and GameCube copies. The shading of each version gives the character models a different look. In the PlayStation 2 version, the shading is flatter. The shading over the models made the characters look more monotone and paler compared to the GameCube release. With the GameCube release, the cell shading here is much more defined. Instead of what seems like a one layer of shading in the PlayStation 2 version, the shading here makes it seem like there's more layers to the point that looks like an early PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 game to some extent. The character models look almost different, but more shading, the colors on the character models pop more, and it looks more in line with what they would do in the anime and the later games down the line. This doesn't mean the PlayStation 2 version looks bad. In fact, even though it's probably nostalgia, I think it's more my speed because they use a more aggressive cell shading style on the character models in the GameCube version. It shows that they did not do the same for the environment. It makes the character chapters feel out of place compared to the cohesiveness of the PlayStation 2 version. One thing that fell out of place was the story arc that it ended on at the time. The game's story follows the Saiyan saga to the Cell saga. No Buu saga, but it did have some extras. They have what if stories tacked on and a Hercule story as well, but I didn't do those. I ended up doing them. Other than that, the structure of the story is set up like an episode of Dragon Ball Z. You have a narrator at the beginning and the end of each section recapping events or transitioning you into the next story beat. This gives you that episodic flair that I wish modern anime games would take advantage of when making popular franchises into games. Throughout your first playthrough of the story, they kind of skip important fights and events that happen, meaning you only play as Goku, Piccolo, and Gohan throughout the main story. It's not as bad as you can go back into the story and play other points of view, meaning you can eventually play the Vegeta versus 18 fight. This gives it that old school replayability beyond versus matches. Little fact, Budokai was actually the first DBZ game that would have fully 3D rendered cutscenes, but the main story being so condensed, I was able to beat both the GameCube and the PlayStation 2 version rather quickly. In the story, there are moments like this. This was mad hard as a kid, and going in I thought it was going to take forever to do. But for both versions of the game, I did it on the first try compared to when I was a kid. I would have been done for the day after losing 10 times in a row in this little mini game. Something that got lost over time were my skills in combat. Combat in this game rests on a 2D plane with 3D sidestepping. If you watch my Naruto Classic Ninja Mini Retrospective, you would know I compared this series' combat to theirs. To make this easy on myself, I'm going to use the in-game button prompts to explain the combat because I played two different versions. With 4 front-facing buttons, each one is tied to a specific move. P gives you punch, K gives you a kick, E gives you a ki blast or an energy blast, while G lets you guard. You can mix and match these based on the command strings given to you in the command list. There are also some that are not a part of the command list that you can use. For example, pressing P 4 times then E with Goku gives him a combo that ends in a Kamehameha. Combination of buttons are important as they give your character access to guard breaking moves such as simultaneously holding P and K will give you a charge move. Some can send the opponent flying with the stage transition. Charge moves in this game could be cancelled by pressing the guard button, opening it up to what would be stiff gameplay without it. I read somewhere that this wasn't supposed to be a part of the game initially, but they kept it anyway. I can't do it anymore, but it definitely gives you more freedom than your average anime game. Other moves such as transformations were also used with button combinations. If you have unlocked the ability yet, pressing PKG will let's say Gohan while you have a certain amount of bar will let you go Super Saiyan 2. With transformations being a huge reason why people like Dragon Ball Z, having them be a useful tool in battle really helps out, of course, at the cost of ki. The ki bar in Budokai goes up to 7. You charge ki by holding down the guard button and double tapping back. This bar goes down over time based on which transformation you use. More moves like 4P into E require energy as well, and as I acquire more skills, the more bar they would take. Like most old games, you had to unlock characters and abilities by actually playing the game. Characters would be unlocked by playing the story mode, while skills could be bought or unlocked with Zenny or progressing through the story. Skills were these capsules you could buy from Mr. Popo to equip the character. They were separated into 3 categories. Special for special moves like Special Beam Cannon, Physical for things like Dragon Throw, and Support for things like Sensu Beam. They also had a gamble one, kind of like a gacha machine, and a recommended one where they give you one that they recommend you have. Some were really good, while others was stuff like Goku's Heart Disease. Collecting all the capsules was something that I wanted to do because those capsules could be used to make your character more unique to you. It's like Dragon Ball Xenoverse before Dragon Ball Xenoverse, also made by them. Other than story mode, World Tournament is the other prominent mode in DBZ Budokai. In this mode, you fight like they would in the Dragon Ball world by entering 3 different ranking single elimination tournaments. This mode can be played against the computer, and if I'm not mistaken, other humans as well. I couldn't get no one to play with me. Anyway, if you win or get second place, you will get Zenny to spend on capsules. Revisiting my first Dragon Ball Z game is always special, whether it be the HD collection or my PS2 version or my newly acquired GameCube version. It shows how far DBZ games have come graphically, whether it be music plagiarized or not. I'll talk about that in another retrospective. Or the way they were structured as video games. It harkens back to a time where anime games had a certain presentation to them that modern anime games don't.